Jerry Seib, executive Washington editor of the Wall Street Journal. All right, Jerry, so the U.S. is watching. What else can it do?
Well, first of all, let's step back. There were protests like this in 2006 in Iran, 2007, 2009. At each of those stages, the U.S. tried to figure out what can we do to sort of further the process and to show that we support the idea of regime change in Iran. But it's tricky because you want to show support for the protesters without doing it in a way that allows the Iranian regime to portray the protesters as American stooges. And if you want to use this as an opportunity, as President Trump seems to impose more sanctions, you need to find a way to make sure those sanctions hit the regime, not the people in the streets, the very people you want to support. So this is tricky. I think what the administration is trying to do is two things. First, think about imposing some additional economic sanctions on Iran, which they can do under existing authority to protest human rights violations, but also to work out an international response in which the U.S. and some of its European partners make a statement of support for the people in the street, their right to be there to protest things that they don't like about the economic and political situation in Iran.
Yeah, interesting. In '79, it was the students who helped to depose the Shah and ultimately set up the kind of government that they have now. It's the students who are back out in the streets this time protesting what they've got.
Well, the students then are now the people in charge of the regime now, yeah. So it's a reversal. But again, this was true in 2006 and 2007. In particular, those were student-led protests, and the George W. Bush administration tried really hard to figure out then how can we support them in a way that might produce a change in the regime or the character of the regime, at least in Iran. And they couldn't figure out how to do it without creating a backlash. And what happens in these situations in Iran, and it's happened repeatedly, is the hardliners in the regime use this kind of protest as an excuse not just to say this is the West trying to undermine our revolution, but to crack down and to squeeze the moderates in the regime, to the extent there are any, off to the side and into the margins. And so what the hardliners can do in Iran, and probably will in this case, is use this as an excuse to take over more power, not less.
Yeah, there are some who suggest that this might be an opportunity for the world, really, to renegotiate the Iran nuclear deal. Here's what Senator Lindsey Graham had to say over the weekend.
If I were President Trump, I would have a nationwide address pretty soon explaining why the Iranian nuclear deal is a bad deal for the world, what a better deal would look like, and urge Congress and the European allies to get a better deal with Iran before it's too late.
Is this perhaps, Jerry, an opportunity to do something like that?
Well, look, the Europeans' interest, our allies' interest, the other partners in this deal interest in renegotiating is near zero. So I don't think that's going to happen. The U.S. could pull out of the deal entirely. That wouldn't take it away. It would still be in place. It simply wouldn't include the U.S. as a partner. What could happen, and what I think in the first instance will be the attempt here, is to start some new negotiations with Iran over its missile program and its support for terrorism. And if the Iranians don't want to cooperate in that effort, then use that as an excuse to impose some more economic sanctions. And the Europeans might be willing to go along with that. But right now, the U.S. continues to stand alone on the idea that the nuclear deal ought to be renegotiated.
Those 2009 protests in Iran, the feeling in that country, at least, was that the U.S. did almost nothing to help them. Would that be the same case this time around, do you think?
Well, I think already you see the rhetoric out of this administration is different than it was in 2009 out of the Obama administration. Again, it's hard to know what is more helpful here. If you express your support for the protesters in too obvious a way and at too high a volume, you run the risk of undermining their legitimacy internally. And so if you don't do that, you run the risk of being accused of standing by silently and not lending support. So it's hard to get this balance right. And as I said, I think repeatedly administrations in Washington haven't quite figured out how to do that.
3 successive administrations have faced this issue, as you point out.
Yep.
Jerry Seib, Wall Street Journal. Good to have you on. Thank you.